Okay, well, I was an electronic systems engineer for about 10 to 12 years. Then I left all that, became a psychologist, and then I left that in an interesting way. A woman that I was counseling at the Marina Counseling Center in San Francisco worked for Arthur Andersen, the consulting company, and she said, "We need this, what you got." And I was teaching her creative thinking and all that. And this was in the early 80s. And so she said, but you gotta get rid of the psychobabble. So I ended up doing a lot of work for Arthur Andersen, and then they introduced me to Dow Chemical, Silicon Valley, Hewlett-Packard, just everybody. And I was just wound up and busy for the next 20 years. And so now I still do it, but I evolved a lot of stuff that I did. So I taught a lot of things about self-organization and, from a systems perspective, and how organizations and teams can self-organize and discover what's emergent, what is already trying to happen, and that kind of stuff. And then executive coaching and leadership development, and goes on and on. So anyway, with that introduction, we'll get going. So our shared purpose today, as I see it, is to build the foundation for becoming more agile and effective through self-mastery, and in a way that is experiential and accelerates the evolution of consciousness, so that all of us can increase our contribution to co-creating the we world we all want. So is everybody in tune with that shared purpose?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's my picture of the world right now, the environmental pressure. Space and time is shrinking, product life cycles are shrinking, knowledge life cycles, what we know is becoming obsolete faster and faster. Environmental sustainability is in decline. And we have, driving a lot of that is the convergence of sciences, technologies, and artificial intelligence. The world that we see today isn't going to be the world that we see even 5 years from now. It's going to be a dramatic shift. And the innovation and new knowledge creation, technical complexity, information services, social complexity due to globalization, virtualization, social media, social nets, incubators, startups, it's just going crazy. And then within bigger organizations, you see committees, councils, dotted lines. The old classic organizational structure where there's departments and all that is now, it still exists, but there's all this cross stuff going on. And so faced with that is the role relationship instability. People have to learn new roles, they have to learn them fast. There's cross-blurred boundary conversations, and there's all kinds of cultures, mindsets, values, and generations all kind of dancing around in the same space. And the rate of disruptive change or chaos is happening. And what we have in that space is an increase in the me first commanders, bullies, and hiders. The hiders are the response to bullies. So, and then we see resistance, stress, unproductive conversations, conflict, toxic behavior. And the point is, humans created this environment, now it is trying to recreate humans. So this is what we're faced with, and what's the optimal response to this? How do we adapt to that environment?
What's a hider?
Huh?
What's a hider?
A hider is someone who in an organization just hides, just is quiet, doesn't stick their neck out, just does their own little thing, and and doesn't want to be confronted with something or confront others, so they just sit there and they do their own thing. Hiders, and another term for them is doers. But we'll be talking about doers later.
That sounds like you're describing almost everyone in an organization.
Well, some people, yeah, but now other people are very, very aggressive, assertive, and over the top. Okay. So, what is already trying to happen? Who is that asking us to be? What does that? What are the implications for that for us? How is it asking us to show up and engage with one another? What is it asking us to do? So, my view is the universal law of success for all living systems, no matter which one, is sense and response agility. How do we accurately sense what's going on in a situation and how do we effectively respond to it in a way that's consistent with me to we. And we're going to be talking some more about that in a minute. Because the environmental context we're in now is mostly me first, although it is changing, and I can say it's changing fairly quickly towards we. And there's a lot of things that are happening that weren't just happening 6 or 7 years ago that are beginning to produce the me. And it's even happening in schools, in some school systems. At very young ages, we're starting to see things. So, how do we accurately sense? How do we effectively respond? And then self-mastery is the foundation for that. If we don't get that part together, it's hard for us to do the rest. So in an individual system, sense and responsibility, what is already trying to happen? This agility is being both a specialist and a generalist, technical, business, and people savvy, process systems, and results oriented, and having whatever your primary current role is, and then in addition to that, the inquirer, being able to make inquiry, come into shared understanding, and in the process facilitate the evolution of somebody else, the evolution of their consciousness, without teaching them consciousness or anything, but just by the way you engage them and ask questions and stuff like that. And then being a creator and an innovator. Innovate, innovate, innovate. That is in any context that we're in. And then is, how do we advocate? How do we negotiate? How do we operate as a collaborative leader? So each of these roles has different mindsets, different ways of being, different skill sets. And then how do we be a change leader? How do we effectively go out and affect change? And then how do we be a knowledge manager? Because knowledge management is going to be a big, big thing, because the knowledge life cycles are shrinking and new knowledge is being created extremely rapidly. So that baseline for all that is self-mastery, aligning leadership architecture, and agile evolutionary leadership. Situational effective, me to we. How do we facilitate me to we? So, these are the stages of development. How many people are aware of these? These are the stage of development in adults. It goes from diplomat, being you-oriented, wanting to fit in. And so when you first show up in an organization, typically the first thing on your mind is fitting in. So you go from being the conformist, the diplomat, the you worldview, strong need to fit in, get along. Then it goes to becoming an expert at something, becoming really good at something, a technician. And then that's the process of going from you to me. And it's self-discipline, self-control, reliance on your own experience and judgment. And then it goes on to me worldview. And now organizational and country culturals play into this, and they can feed it. So the me worldview is independent, strong intention to see, be the best, identify its role or goal, respects differences, but low mutuality and projects problems onto others. I am the greatest is the way that extreme. So what kind of a president did we just elect? And America, what day was America born on?
July?
Independence Day. So in our culture, there is a cultural artifact that is influencing and shaping our tendency towards a very me world. So that's part of what needs to change too. And then there's the strategist, or the we, where the movement is we, where the shift is concerned interpersonal relationships, strategic systemic thinking, growing self-knowledge, less projection, greater mutuality, and a shift from personal goals to shared goals, which is what this organization is all about. And then there's the autonomist, the magician, the alchemist, the we worldview, whose autonomy of self and their principal role is to facilitate the evolution of other people, is to, and with a strong sense of purpose. What?
Aren't we doing that here too?
Yes.
We're working on it.
Yes.
On some level, we
probably working on all of them.
All of them,
Yeah.
right. I mean, because they don't go away. You follow me? And
They're like nested circles.
yeah. And so, yeah, in one situation you may be something. In another situation you may be at another level. But the issue is, where are you most of the time? And what is most purposeful to you? So, yeah, they are nested circles in a way, right? And so, we're not going to go into this too deeply, but this is the psychological foundation for these levels. So Maslow and Assagioli, Maslow had his pyramid of human needs: physiological security, love, acceptance, esteem, self-actualization. And then Wilbur lines tiers and levels. So you see cognitive, affective, self, and then different tiers. And so the issue is, you go from diplomat to expert to achiever to strategist to autonomous magician. And then Lovinger, Torbert, and Kagan, they had levels as well. Kagan is from Harvard. He's probably the one that did the most accepted work, although Jane Lovinger was behind the whole thing and the first one to really develop. She's at Washington University in St. Louis. And Ken Wilber suggests that the single biggest acceleration of the evolution of consciousness is disidentification. And that's the essence of what we're going to be doing today. Is we're going to be learning a lot about disidentification. How do we disidentify ourselves? How do we facilitate it in others? How do we loosen people's attachment? Because identification is an attachment. How do we loosen their attachment to their mental models, ways of seeing the world, and all that? So, and here's the data. This is about 5 years old. We see that adults, this is Lovinger, and then Torbert from Boston College, he measured the managers, and then Bush and Gibbs from the University of Vancouver did engineers and managers. And look at the look at the data. 79 to 95% of the people are at me or you. And only, and the strategist, only 14% in Lovinger's model. Torbert is 4.6%. Bush and engineers and managers, 15%. When you pull engineers into the situation, there is a shift right there. And it's because of, I can't explain it for sure, but there is a shift because they're typically more mentally developed, and oftentimes that moves them away from the emotional attachment to being me the greatest. And they realize they have to work together. And then the magician, in Torbert's model, there are none. And adults is Jane Lovinger's is 6.2%, Bush and Gibbs 1.6. And I have had a conversation with Torbert, and he's very disillusioned. This was like 4 years ago. He didn't think anything was going to change. Okay, so let's look at, now we're going to look at psychology from a systems perspective. So in complex self-adaptive systems, what is psychological self-organization? What are we made of? What do we consist of? And so in all individuals, there's a drive for growth, effectiveness. And then what typically happens is there's some dissonance, some dissatisfaction, some unsatisfied need or want, or there's a change in the environment or a sense of fulfillment. I'm complete with this, I'm done with this. And then all of a sudden, out of that, through all this dynamic inside, there's emergence. A strange attractor emerges. An image, an idea, a way of being, a possible way of being. It could be a dream, whatever it is, but then it self-organizes and becomes a subsystem. So now there's a new part of me, because we are not one person. We are multiple people. We have different roles we play in different situations. We can be a mother, we can be a father, we can be a kid, we can be a buddy, we can be an achiever, whatever it is. It all depends upon the situation we're in. So these subsystems have roles, they're partial identities, and they have mindsets, beliefs, and values. And those are not necessarily consistent with all of these different parts we play. So we have increasing complexity. So, and then whenever there's this emergence, a new subpersonality, a subsystem, whatever you want to call it, gets created. But in amongst that, there's an I. And what today is all about is discovering this I and reinforcing this I and being able to make it distinct from everything else that's in me. And developing the will to not only be aware from that I, but to make the changes we want to make. And it doesn't mean, well, we'll get into it all the way. So here's some self-organized systems. In the body system, we see cardiovascular, neurological, skeletal, etc. In family subsystems, if you're familiar with family psychology, is you see all of these coalitions. There's the favorite, there's the hero, who does the chores, what are the roles they play, what are the groupings. There could be grouping sister and brother and all that. There's groupings. There's the mover, the initiator, the mascot. Who's the mascot in this family? The shaker, opposer, critic, blamer, scapegoat. Who takes the hit? Who's the fall guy in this family? And so you have all of these family subsystems. And then there's a follower and the person who makes the rules. And then there's the decision maker, which might be the mother, father, whatever. And now in individual subsystems in us, we see the creator, the hero, the greatest, the engineer, the sales rep, the marketer, the consultant, the driver, mother, father, activist, mover, initiator, talker, golfer, buddy, whatever. We play all these different roles. And then in organizational systems, we see the same thing. We see cultural success strategy, like in Silicon Valley, it's bet the company on an innovation and depend upon heroes to deliver. In Motorola, the cultural success strategy was get the deal no matter what the price and depend upon engineering and manufacturing to make it at a profit. Then you have management, you have councils, you have boards, you have communities of practice, you have informal groupings, you have movers, you have shakers, opposers. All of those things that are in family subsystems also show up in organizational subsystems. So, what are some of the self-mastery challenges we face? So take a moment and just look over that. And identify what you think. Yeah, just fill it out. Just circle it.
I don't want to take your color.
Okay.
How often do you get hooked, emotionally upset, frustrated, defensive, or angry? How often are you very critical or judgmental of self or others? How often do you get caught up in unproductive conflict? How often are you fearful, old habits, set goals, not follow through, resilience or adaptive? What new mindset, skills, behaviors, or attitude would make you more effective? What's getting in the way of acquiring them? How can we become aware of the sub-personalities, if you will, the subsystems, our parts, so that we can be more aware? And with awareness, it's great, but awareness without will, not so great.
Yeah, well, I think true
So
awareness.
awareness is a key part, if we can act upon that awareness. If we can't act upon it, then we're screwed. A lot of people have these different personas, roles. It could be a geek, manager, subordinate, consultant, thought leader, the greatest, diplomat, achiever, activist, perfectionist, father, mother, golfer. And then there's defensive roles, like the judge, the victim, the fighter, the justifier.
What's the golfer?
The golfer is the guy who plays golf. I mean, I'm a golfer. I started playing golf when I was 10 years old. I used to shagged balls for this woman. She was an Irish woman golfer in Situate, Massachusetts. Hatherley Country Club. I used to shag. She taught me how to play golf, and then her caddy got sick, so she said, "Can you carry my bag at this tournament?" So she won that tournament, and she said, "No, you've got to carry it for me for another tournament." She won that tournament, and now she wanted me to take me on the road for her. And my aunt, I was living with my aunt and uncle. They said, "No, you're not going on the road with her. You got to go to school." So anyway,
You could have become a golfer.
so I started playing golf when I was like 10 years old, and then well, my family, we had a golf course in Cape Cod for a few years. We lost a lot of money, but anyway. So, and as we move throughout the day, see, our sense of I-ness moves from one of those roles to others. So we shift identities as we move throughout the door. Ken Wilber describes them as functional self-presentations that navigate particular psychosocial situations. And then we tend to reflexively identify with whatever success strategy is associated with the context. We in effect switch heads without even thinking about it. Well, we switch, like I may be, if I'm at home and if I'm with my wife, I could be just a loving, loving husband.
Okay.
And then I go out the door and I go to play golf. What the hell with her? The hell with her, I'm going to play golf.
Okay.
You know,
So then your success strategies.
what I identify with in my mindset, what I think about, what's important to me, shifts.
Yeah. And do you notice those things when they're shifting?
Well, that's the whole idea behind awareness. Because if we don't, then we're operating at the effect of the environment. Because sometimes we can go into a culture and we start acting like the culture, like most people who go to a company. And if the culture is shit, then we start acting like shit.
So if we go back to your earlier slide with the emergence of the I among all the subselves, these could be included as all these subselves
Yes.
of the I. So part of the things,
no, the I is, what we're going to be seeing later is the I is distinct.
the I is distinct, but it emerges from
But what
the integration of the.
yeah, but the I is something that we can self-discover. It is a center of awareness and will. But the will is teeny tiny. So we have to learn how to leverage that teeny tiny thing. So almost all mindfulness techniques are intended to give you that 1/4 inch space between yourself and these roles you play.
The willing self in the roles.
Well, if you say the willing self, that may be the I, depending upon how you do it. But we're going to be exploring that experientially in a few minutes.
Okay.
So these are of the particular subsystems that get created. As you have your own unique set. This is just we don't all create all of these, but we each have. Most people can identify 10 to 12 what they call subpersonalities. At the University of Bristol in the UK, they did some studies on terms of how the number of parts people have, number of subpersonalities they have, and their effectiveness. And so I don't want to get into it, it'll take too long, but at any rate, they're called subpersonalities, subselves, parts, whatever you want to call them. And yeah, they're not all aligned. But according to this study at the University of Bristol in the UK, if you have one or two majors, they divide them up into majors and minors. And so typically might have one or two majors. The achiever will typically have one major and the rest will be minors. And they'll hardly engage in them even at home. If they're over-identified with being the greatest, sometimes that can spread in lots of contexts, not just their business context. So, but typically, if you have one or two majors and 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 minors, you will be the most agile.
Typically,
if you have 1 or 2 majors and then 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 minors, you will be the most agile.
As opposed to having one major.
As opposed to having 1 or 2 majors and no minors. So the point is, once our sense of I-ness goes into one of those subsystems, we become identified with it, and we have a mindset, a purpose, an urge, a need, a belief, emotion, or an idea that is trying to get expressed or needs to be satisfied. And accordingly, it drives the way we see ourselves, the world, and the possibilities. So once we identify something with something, that selects out what we see, assigns significance to it, we like it, don't like it, or we're neutral about it, and then makes inferences, and that's how we see the world. And so we never see the world as it is. We see the world based upon what we're identified with in the moment. So we're like a horse with blinders.
Yeah.
You know, I wondered why they put horses. Did anybody know why they put blinders on horses?
The peripheral vision of the horse is what triggers it to be afraid.
Exactly. Because if you take their blinders off, I asked a carriage driver over in San Francisco, I said, what's the blinders for? He said, if I took them off, the horse would go berserk and jump free and wouldn't know what the hell to do because too much information would be coming in. And that's the same thing with us. When you think about it, it's the same thing with us a little bit.
They freak out in city traffic.
Right. So, anyway, the mindset, purpose, and beliefs are silently working in the hidden assumptions we make before we even think about it. What we hear and thought are the inferences and conclusions. So, solve this problem. There was a man at home. The man at home was wearing a mask. There's another man coming home. What's going on here?
Wearing a mask.
Yeah. What's going on here?
Hundreds of interpretations.
So what? They're in different houses. Uh-huh. What else?
Man wearing a mask, like an oxygen mask or something.
Okay, so maybe somebody's sick?
Maybe.
Okay, what else?
Also be a burglar.
A what? A burglar, right.
Yeah, that could be one. I think there's a bunch of different interpretations.
Yeah, like what?
A man was on a dream journey.
Halloween party, right.
A dream journey of different
Right.
selves.
I mean, it could be something kinky going on, right?
A man at home wearing a mask.
Right. So, do you know what's going on?
Yeah.
What?
But I know this.
Oh, you know it, yeah.
Another
So I'm not
man.
gonna say it.
It's a baseball game.
At home.
So now, if we were identified as a sports guy, sitting in a ball state or something like that, we would get that right away. But if we're not, and our mindset is somewhere else, where do we go? So I mean, that's the whole idea behind how, right? So again, you know, burglary, doctor, kinky, Halloween, whatever. Again, we have a mask on, and we select out based upon what we are identified with. And if we ask the same question of a person sitting at a baseball game, they'd probably get it like that. So, and people at ease with the problems of the greatest can seldom accept even the simplest, most obvious truth if it would oblige them to admit the falsity of their conclusions. They have delighted in explaining them to colleagues, teaching them to others in a way that wove their thread by thread into the fabric of their lives. I mean, that's how identity, in a way, gets created. So it's being able to be this and also be this. So, and we're going to be showing, I'll show you a slide later that nails what you just said. So, here's a couple of examples. The diplomat. What are the mindset is and purpose is, it's what I got to do is get along. That's the number one thing for me is get along. I'm the diplomat. And so, what are the context opportunities to affiliate, partner up, team up? That's what I'm looking for. And then what are the threats? Conflict and a loss of connection to somebody. Those are the threats. And so the pluses are they're affiliators, they get along, they build harmony, understanding, receptive listener, trustworthy, dependable, self-sacrificing, hardworking, loyal, team player. What are the minuses of the diplomat? Low assertiveness, overcommits themselves, avoids productive conflict. They won't disagree with anything anybody says. They acquiesce quickly, they won't challenge the status quo. And the unintended consequences, problems not confronted, little innovation, nothing changes. And then there's the doer. And this is a classic one in that stage between you first and me first. And their context, most engineers in the early stage of their work fall into this category. Challenges, opportunities, big tasks, need to get it done. What threatens them is distractions. They do not want to be distracted. They want to stay focused. Intelligent, confident, pushes self, detail-oriented, dependable, gets it done. That's the name thing. Minuses never look up, uninterested in the big picture, doesn't get distracted, inflexible, impatient, easily frustrated, and they criticize themselves. Typically, I always could do better. The unintended consequence, don't see the big picture or emerging factors, lose track of the vision. Work may not sync with others or new directions. Can't tell you how many engineers in the Silicon Valley, they go off and they work on their own, and their work doesn't sync. They end up, their work doesn't sync with the rest of the work. I mean, so part of all of what I did in Silicon for a long time is build knowledge managing communities where people, knowledge they made it visible, they kept clear, and they learned how to move beyond this. So here's the thing, we show up in a situation, we're identified with being creative or whatever, and somebody trashes our idea or our creation or whatever. What triggers? Remember, we're selective sensing. What triggers? We triggers a reactive freeze, fight, or flight response. And so our sense of I-ness goes from being in the creative thing into being emotionally upset, pissed off, whatever. And then it goes into some defensive strategy. The judge, the victim, you know, some people might think they were a victim. Other people might think they're a judge. Oh, that son of a bitch. You know, Peter, what the hell are you doing? Or they get into fighting. How dare you do that to me, you asshole? Do you follow me? And then they'll justify it later, what they did. They'll say, oh God, he's such an asshole. I don't know why he asked us to do that. And then the complainer, why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. So we have all of these different defensive strategies. And then the outcome is unproductive conflict, ineffectiveness, pebbles, stress, wasted time, wasted energy, lost opportunity. The defensive strategies get reinforced, and everybody ends up with pebbles. What do we mean by pebbles?
Pebbles?
Yeah. What happens when you get a pebble in your shoe with somebody? Yep. So every time you see them or they say something, the pebble takes your perception and distorts it into misreading what they're saying, what they're
Like
doing.
the princess and the pea.
There is really a bee.
So the issue is, you know, once we put a pebble in somebody's shoe or they put a pebble in our shoe, the relationship has changed. Because that will then influence what we select out and how we perceive that person from that moment on. So when people have a pebble in our shoe with you, what do you do about it? Well, when we get to the inquirer, the next phase, all the inquirer is about is how do you clear pebbles? How do you, and then preventing conflict. Preventing conflict is a lot about clearing pebbles. Because they're inevitable. Because people can show up identified with one thing, you're somewhere else, and no matter what you say, they can misinterpret it, and they'll end up with a pebble in their shoe.
They will become a bed of coals.
Yeah, so at any rate, you show up with an initial purpose or intention, and it's a good one, honorable one, and it ends up corrupted. And virtually all interactive breakdowns are a result of over-identification. Our sense of I-ness goes from where we were when we showed up into the fifth fight, freeze, fight, into the defensive strategy, and then bang. And then our point of view of that person may have changed forever. You're in a situation and there's a symbolic threat to you. Someone says, this sucks. How many of you have ever heard that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. And you figure, oh, deflated, disappointed. And the judge, your judge, agrees with them. It is so bad. How did I make that mistake? I blew it. You know, and then the victim comes in and says, why am I so stupid? Oh my shit. God, I believe I make it up better. I better make it up somehow. Then there's someone says, you gotta be kidding me. This is a real quote that I'm seeing from a VP of a big company. You gotta be kidding me. This is bullshit, you know. And then the person's stress, tightening in the upper back, shoulder, shortness of breath, and the judge, he didn't know diddly. And then the fighter, anger, what the hell are you doing here, you know? And then the justifier, he is so stupid, rationalizable, and people end up with a pebble. And then someone says, did you not hear me? Were you not at the meeting? Contractions, all the same stuff. And then someone states a different point of view, and then the other person feels misunderstood, criticized, moody. And the judge says, they deliberately misrepresented what I'm trying to say. Do you follow me? So it goes on and on and on. At any rate, they all end up with pebbles. And then, which of these behaviors hook you? The complainer. How many of you know a complainer? Right. How many of you know a space invader? Right. How many of you know a downsider? I mean, before you even hardly open your mouth, they're talking about the potential downside of what you're talking about. How many know resistors? How about a critic or a judge? Oh, you mean your own? And then how about a know-it-all? So you see, 80% of the problems in organizations have to do with human relationships. It's not with the technical issues, the business issues. 80% of the problems. So the idea is to become aware of what hooks you. And then you have a choice. Then the question is, do you have the willpower to make the choice?
Okay.
Do you follow me? Because you can be aware of it and it can still tick you off. So if you got to have the awareness and the will, and then we're going to be looking, that's where we're going to focus on at the end, is discover our deeper sense of I, our awareness in our will, and be able to leverage our will, because our will is this teeny tiny little thing. The whole idea is these people aren't aware that that's the way they are, and they do it all the time. So in certain situations, it's important to recognize the downside of something. Do you follow me? But if that's the first word out of somebody's mouth and it's constant, they're a downsider. And that may be valuable in some context. It's not to say that it's total nonsense. It could be valuable. It's important for somebody to recognize the downsides, the risks. However, if they do it for everything, I mean minor little things like, you know, putting a glove in your back seat and then getting out of the car, your car's locked. Somebody's going to steal that glove. I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, things like that, it just can go to the extreme. I mean, so, you know, it isn't like these are all bad. It's just that if they're overdone and people aren't aware that they're doing it and they do it all the time, then it could be an issue because it could put a pebble in people's shoes. Okay, so reactive perception, emotional escalation. So we show it, we're in a defensive strategy, and we have a threat radar up, and we subjectively assess plus, minus, or neutral, and then we draw a conclusion, then we go over an emotional escalation. So there's a feedback loop between the thinking, the feelings, and the sensing that reinforces it and takes our eye away and generates physical tests and stretching, whatever. So think of a couple of interpersonal situations that you've been in where that generated the fight, flight, or freeze response in you. And keep in mind that stress is the response of your perception of the event, not the event itself. So here's what pebbles look like. Somebody gets into a conflict or something with somebody, and they come to a conclusion that he's as stubborn as a mule. And now that's what the pebble in his shoes says. And so every time he sees him, he's looking through the lens and looking for possibilities of this person being as stubborn as a mule. It doesn't go away once the pebble is there. And pebbles sustain conflict, because remember, we're selectively sensing at all times. We have to. We can't see the whole world all at once, all the time. We have to focus. What are the pluses and minuses of this process of identification? we automatically identify as we move throughout the day with our ideas, ways of being, whatever. What are the pluses of this automatic identification, and what are the minuses of it? If we don't thinking about everything and we don't have to be aware of everything every moment, then we don't have to make all those choices. It's faster, it's more efficient and effective most of the time. So automatic identification isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, the minuses are it's difficult, in difficult or challenging situations, defensive strategies take over and usually make matters worse. When we're over-identified with one success strategy, we are typically cut off from the qualities, traits, and attributes of the others. Some me-first legacy success strategies have beliefs and behaviors that may be less effective in today's world, to say the least. So, and the other is, our choices disidentified are what? If we're totally disidentified, what are our choices? I could take you through an exercise. It would take about 10 minutes. But you would get the point that totally disidentified, our choices are so broad that it's hard to make a decision. It's just hard to make a decision. And our choices over-identified are next to nothing. Once we're over-identified with something, whatever we're identified makes the choice, that's it.
Right.
So, what do we do? So the self-mastery, the real problems is why is it so difficult in real time to stop emotional upsets, unproductive conflicts, stress, distractions, procrastination, resistance, and other counterproductives? And why is it so difficult to adapt or change behaviors or habits? What's the real problem? The real problem is lack of awareness. We don't have a choice until we see a choice, so it's real-time sensing. Are we aware that this situation is happening? And what are the early warning signs of stress responses, defensive strategies, over-identification, identification with an ineffective habit, resistance to change, hidden filters, assessments, inferences, assumptions, belief, and the lack of will. We can't choose without the willpower to step back and overcome the momentum of old habits, emotional reactions, over-identification with a mindset or point of view, or lost connection to our original intention, purpose in a situation. When we are clear about and remain connected to our purpose, it is much easier to change our perceptions of events in the situation. So, Danella Meadows, a systems thinker, she points to the top 4 leverage points in a system. The power to transcend paradigms or identity. The mindset or paradigm that the systems, its goals, structure, rules, delays, parameters arise out of. The goal of the system. The power to add, change, evolve a self-organized system structure. And the point is, a system that can see itself and act on what it sees is inherently more effective and agile. So, and here's Schumacher, says, a man has powers of life like the plant, powers of consciousness like the animal, and evidently something more. The mysterious power Z, what is it? How can it be defined? What can it be called? This power Z has undoubtedly a great deal to do with the fact that man is not only able to think, but is also able to be aware of his thinking. There is not merely a thinker, but a thinker capable of watching and studying his own thinking. There is something able to say I, and to direct consciousness in accordance with its own purposes. A master or controller, a power at a higher level than consciousness itself. That's important, a higher level than consciousness itself. This power Z opens up unlimited possibilities for purposeful learning. So I call it I-power. And it's awareness and will. And so it's discovering the inner observer, the director, and it's moving from that org chart at the top to the one at the bottom. So it's discovering it, empowering this sense of I, and then the ability to be aware of and self-manage habits, success strategies, thinking, feeling, sensations. And Roberto Assagioli, psychosynthesis, puts it this way: we're dominated by everything we come identified with. We can master, direct, and utilize everything from which we disidentify ourselves from. So disidentification is the single biggest capacity to facilitate evolution. So the idea is if we can be peripherally aware of all of these transitions, all of these changes in the moment, we don't have to act at the effect of them. We have choices. And Ken Wilber says the single biggest accelerator of the evolution of consciousness is disidentification. That is what facilitates the evolution from you to me to we. And again, as Assagioli says, we're dominated by everything we become identified. So disidentification is how do we recognize when we are in this I, and how do we loosely do it, and then how do we step back from whatever it is and not get caught up in it. So awareness is more accurate, real-time sensing, seeing more choices, the early warning signs, etc. Will is disidentification, the inner power, freedom to choose, to overcome the momentum of habits, feelings, defensive strategies, accelerate learning, and strengthen the qualities of will, commitment, perseverance, energy. The stages of the act of will, Assagioli had 12 of them, and he called them psychological laws. I boiled it down to like 6. And and then he had the stages of the act of will, and it's purpose, vision, commit, plan, act, learn. And the whole idea is our problems cannot be solved by the same consciousness that created them in the first place.